So what I'd like to talk about now is the first of a series of videos on um, the way that symbolic interactionists have theorized about the self, the way that social psychologists have theorized about the self. And there are four broad categories or sets of theories about self that we find in sociological social psychology. So I'm going to walk through each one will get its own separate video. Some of them will be a little bit longer, some will be a little bit shorter, but you should, of course, make yourself familiar with all of these. Before I do that, I just wanted to sort of give you guys a quick overview of what we mean by self. Remember, in the last video, we talked about the way in which selves develop. They're not something that are organically originating in humans, but rather things that develop as a result of the interactions that people have with social others. So at birth, we have this capacity for reflexive behavior. One of the things that happens as we engage in interactions with social others as we begin to use the social positions that these people occupy as a resource for evaluating ourself from those perspectives. So we engage in what's called role taking. And again, role taking is facilitated by, among other things, our capacity for reflexive behavior. The end result, or an end result of this process, is the development of a self. Now, a self is defined as a process of reflexive activity that includes both our subjective stream of consciousness, right? So what we're experiencing as individuals taking in information from the world outside of us, as well as our sort of self-concept, our conception of ourself as a physical or a social or a moral being, right? So two different kinds of things that are kind of part and parcel to our self, which is, again, the experiences that we're having, our stream of consciousness, the stuff that we are experiencing and thus knowing. And then, of course, our concept of ourself. When we think about ourself, the thing that we think of is also part of that. Social psychologists in sociology have generally theorized about the self in one of four ways. There are some who see the self as primarily a social or a communicative process. There are others who focus on looking at and trying to understand the self as a social structure. Another group look at the self as a kind of dramatic effect. And finally, there are some theorists who consider the self from a kind of postmodern perspective. And I'm going to walk you through each of those four different ways that symbolic interactionists and social psychologists have tended to theorize about the self. The first will really kind of revisit something we talked about in the last video, which is the perspectives of Mead and Cooley. Remember, Cooley was the guy who developed the concept of the looking glass self, right? The sense of ourself that's based on the reflected appraisals of others, right? This idea that I am who I think you think I am. And Mead, of course, who sees the self as a kind of outgrowth of a process of role taking and an increasingly sophisticated kind of role taking where we go from kind of an imitative play to a stage where we have a sort of fully developed generalized other, which becomes a perspective from which we evaluate ourself. And for Mead, the primary kind of way to kind of illustrate this is to take the self and kind of divide it up into two parts. And he calls these parts the I and the me. And they're both you, don't get me wrong. We're not talking about two different people. We are talking about two different ways that the self kind of operates within an individual. The I is one's sense of agency and action and power. It's the source of action. It's the active source of behavior. And for the me, we're talking about the self as perceived as an object, right? By the eye, right? So when the eye looks at itself, the thing that it's looking at is the me. So when I think about myself, I am thinking about me, right? So I, me, that's where he gets these terms. This me is the self as we imagine others see us, right? So in that way, again, it's kind of like Cooley's looking glass self, except again, for Mead, it's based on a thing that we're doing internally inside our minds. And for Cooley, while the process is unfolding inside our minds, it's based on the reactions of people with whom we're actually in current interaction, right? So they're real live people giving us some immediate feedback and some immediate information about the self that they see, or at least the self we imagine they see. But the thing that you want to remember here for whether we're talking about Cooley or whether we're talking about Mead is we're talking about the self as a kind of internal communication between these two parts of the self. Now, again, only Mead articulated the I and the me. That was not something that Cooley explicitly stated, but you can see that it's kind of there, right? When one imagines how others see us, the thing that's doing the imagining would be Mead's I, and the thing that's being imagined would be Mead's me. So even though Cooley doesn't articulate it that way, you can see that those components are part of his perspective. But again, keeping in mind the I and the me is sort of a way to think about the self as an object to itself. So when you guys read Mead, right, and you read that sentence that begins, the self as an object to itself, that seems a little weird. It seems a little abstract and hard to understand. But really, he's just saying the I and the me, right? And that becomes really, really important, something you want to keep in mind as you do this analysis. We'll talk a little bit more about Mead and Cooley, and you'll see that this idea of an internal conversation between the self as a kind of manifestation of agency, right? The self as an active participant in the world, and the idea that there exists a kind of concept of oneself that is something that is seen by others and in some cases seen internally by one's self. I know this sounds really weirdly abstract, but trust me, the more you make yourself familiar with it, the more it'll kind of just click. But those two notions of self are going to be featured explicitly or implicitly in all of the other theories that we're going to talk about. So Mead and Cooley become really foundational figures in the development of how sociological social psychology looks at and understands and theorizes about the self, and each subsequent iteration or each subsequent group of theorists is going to pick up on one or more of those elements and kind of really dive in. But it all sort of starts with these two guys, Cooley and Mead, who see the self as a kind of social phenomenon that is a process, an internal process of communication between the self as an actor and the self as a thing that is evaluated or understood, a concept. And so that's where we'll pick up next time.